The baby's screams had been tearing through the night for 3 days straight, and Johnny was on the edge of something dark when the knock finally came. He stood in the middle of his small ranch house, swaying on his feet, the infant clutched against his chest like a fragile piece of his shattered world. Eli's face was red and twisted, his tiny fists beating weakly against Johnny's worn shirt. The sound that came from those small lungs seemed impossible, a wail that cut through wood and stone and straight into the deepest part of man's soul. Johnny hadn't slept in 72 hours. His eyes burned like someone had rubbed sand into them. His hands trembled so badly he was afraid he might drop his son. So he held tighter, which only made the baby cry harder. The lamplight flickered across the chaos of his kitchen, unwashed bottles scattered on the counter, sour milk smell mixing with the scent of his own unwashed body in desperation. He tried everything. Fed him, changed him, rocked him, walked him up and down the creaking floorboards until his boots wore a path in the wood. He'd brought in the doctor from town, who'd poked and prodded and found nothing wrong. He'd asked the ranch hands wise for advice, tried their remedies, warm baths and cool cloths, and drops of whiskey on the gums. Nothing worked. Nothing touched whatever pain lived inside his son. Mary had been gone 3 months now. 3 months since she'd bled out on their bed, her hand going cold in his while the midwife worked frantically and uselessly to save her. 3 months since she'd looked at him with those fading eyes and whispered, "Take care of our baby," before the light went out of her forever. Johnny had buried his wife on a Tuesday. The whole town had come, black dresses and solemn faces and casseroles he couldn't taste. They told him he was strong. They told him God had a plan. They told him time would heal. They were all liars. For the first 2 months, Eli had been quiet. An easy baby, everyone said. Slept through the night, barely fussed, just stared at the world with those dark eyes that looked too much like Mary's. Johnny had been grateful then, stumbling through his grief while his son slept peacefully in the cradle Mary had picked out before she knew she wouldn't live to use it. But then something changed. 3 days ago, as the sun set over the prairie, Eli had started crying. And he hadn't stopped. Not for food, not for sleep, not for anything Johnny could offer. It was like someone had flipped a switch inside the child, and now all that came out was anguish. Johnny walked to the window, the baby still screaming against his shoulder. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was creeping across the horizon. Another night survived. Another night that felt like drowning. He caught his reflection in the dark glass, a ghost of the man he used to be. His jaw was covered in 3 days of stubble. His shirt was stained with spit up and tears. He couldn't remember whose. His eyes looked hollow, like someone had reached in and scooped out everything that mattered. He thought about Mary's grave up on the hill, wondered if she could hear their son crying from wherever she'd gone, wondered if she blamed him for not being enough. The dark thoughts came easier now, in these hours before sunrise when the world felt thin and fragile. Thoughts about walking away, just setting the baby down and walking out into the prairie until he disappeared. Thoughts about how maybe Eli would be better off with someone else, someone who knew what they were doing, someone who wasn't stumbling through fatherhood like a drunk man in the dark. Johnny shook his head hard, trying to clear the poison from his mind. He was tired. That's all. Just tired. He wasn't that kind of man. He wasn't a quitter. But God help him. He didn't know how much longer he could do this. That's when a knock came. Soft at first, almost lost under Eli's crying. Then again, more insistent. Johnny froze. It was barely dawn. Who would be at his door at this ungodly hour? For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it, that his exhausted mind was playing tricks. But then it came a third time, steady and sure. He walked to the door, every step an effort, and pulled it open. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of dew and grass, and something he'd almost forgotten, hope. Jessica Bennett stood on his porch in her nightgown and a worn shawl, her feet bare on the wooden planks. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, uncombed and wild from sleep. But her eyes were clear and focused, looking at him with something that wasn't pity, wasn't judgment. Just a quiet kind of knowing that made Johnny's throat tighten. He knew who she was. Everyone in the county knew Jessica Bennett, the widow who lived alone on the struggling ranch next to his, the woman who'd buried a husband and a baby and somehow kept breathing. They'd never spoken more than pleasantries at church, a nod across the general store. But now here she stood, at his darkest hour, like some kind of answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to speak. "I heard him," she said, her voice soft but steady over Eli's screams. "I heard you both. For 3 nights now, I heard." She took a step closer, and Johnny saw that her eyes were rimmed with red, like maybe she hadn't been sleeping either. "Let me hold him," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was something closer to a command, gentle but absolute. Johnny's first instinct was to refuse. His pride reared up, that stubborn masculine need to handle his own problems, to not show weakness, to not need anyone. What kind of father couldn't comfort his own son? What kind of man needed rescuing by a woman he barely knew? But then Eli let out another one of those soul-shredding cries, and Johnny felt something inside him crack open. He looked at Jessica Bennett standing there in the gray light of dawn, barefoot and brave, and he realized he was out of options, out of strength, out of everything except this one last thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone else could do what he couldn't. "Why would you help me?" he asked, his voice coming out rough and broken. Jessica's expression shifted, something painful flickering across her face before she smoothed it away. "Because I can," she said simply. Then, without waiting for permission, she stepped across his threshold and held out her arms. Johnny hesitated only a moment before placing his son into her hands. The moment Eli left his chest, Johnny felt the absence like a physical wound, but also, shamefully, a relief so profound he nearly staggered. Jessica gathered the baby against her, one hand supporting his head, the other pressed flat against his tiny back. She began to rock, a subtle movement from her hips, and started to hum. Not a lullaby Johnny recognized, something older and sadder, a tune that sounded like grief given voice. And then, like a miracle he didn't deserve, Eli's cries began to soften. Jessica's humming filled the small ranch house as Eli's cries faded to whimpers, then finally to silence. Johnny stood frozen, watching this stranger work magic with his son, the baby's tiny fists unclenched. His red face slowly returned to its normal color. Within minutes, those dark eyes that had been wild with anguish began to flutter closed. Jessica kept rocking, kept humming that sad, ancient tune, and Johnny felt his own knees go weak. The silence, after 3 days of screaming, was so profound it almost hurt. He stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the wall, then slowly slid down to sit on the floor. His hands were shaking worse than before. Jessica glanced at him once, her expression unreadable, then moved to the rocking chair by the cold fireplace and sat down, never breaking the rhythm of her movement. Eli's breathing evened out. The baby's mouth fell open slightly, completely relaxed for the first time in days. He was asleep, actually truly asleep. Johnny pressed his palms against his eyes and felt hot tears leak through his fingers. He couldn't stop them. 3 days of holding it together, of being strong, of pretending he could handle this, and now it all came pouring out. He tried to cry quietly, but his shoulders shook with it. When he finally looked up, Jessica was watching him with those knowing eyes, still rocking his son, and she didn't look away, didn't tell him to pull himself together, didn't say anything at all. After a while, still holding the sleeping baby with one arm, she stood and moved to his kitchen. Johnny watched in dazed silence as she somehow managed to light the stove one-handed, fill the kettle from the pump, and set it to boil. Her movements were practiced, efficient. She'd done this before, he realized. Held a baby while doing everything else life required. The coffee she made was strong and bitter, and when she handed him the cup, he took it with both hands like a man receiving communion. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice wrecked. Jessica nodded and sat back down, adjusting Eli against her shoulder. The baby didn't even stir. "He's been grieving," she said quietly, looking down at the infant's peaceful face. Babies can feel loss, even when they don't understand it. He knows his mother's gone. He's been crying for her. The words hit Johnny like a fist to the chest. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know they could feel that." Jessica's smile was sad and small. "They feel everything. They just can't tell us with words." Johnny sipped his coffee and studied her in the growing morning light. Jessica Bennett couldn't have been more than 30, but she carried herself like someone much older. There was something worn about her, like a river stone smoothed by too much current. Her hands, he noticed, bore the calluses of hard work. Her wedding ring was gone, but a pale line marked where it had been. "Your baby," he said carefully. "I heard you lost a baby." Jessica's rocking slowed for just a moment, then resumed. "Samuel," she said. "He was born sleeping 2 years ago. Never took a breath in this world." Her voice was steady, but Johnny heard the ocean of pain beneath it. "My husband Thomas died the year before that. Thrown from a horse. Broke his neck." She said like she was reciting facts from someone else's life. "I'm sorry," Johnny said, and meant it. Jessica looked at him, then really looked at him, and something passed between them. A recognition. Two people who'd both stood at the edge of that dark pit where grief tried to pull you under. "I know you are," she said. "That's why I came. Because I remember what it feels like when everyone tells you to be strong, but nobody actually helps you carry the weight." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher. Johnny finished his coffee. Jessica kept rocking. Eli slept on, peaceful as Johnny had never seen him. Finally, as the light turned golden, Jessica stood carefully and brought the baby to Johnny. He took his son with trembling hands, afraid the transfer would wake him, but Eli stayed asleep, his little face serene. "I'll come back tonight," Jessica said, adjusting her shawl. "If you'll let me." Johnny's pride wanted to say no, wanted to insist he could handle it now. But he looked at his sleeping son, then at the woman who'd crossed the prairie in her nightgown because she'd heard them suffering, and he nodded. "Please," he said, "I can't do this alone." Jessica's expression softened. "None of you else can," she said. "That's the secret nobody tells you." She walked to the door, then paused. "Johnny," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his name. "You're not failing him. You're just one person trying to do the work of two. That's not weakness. That's impossible." Then she was gone, walking barefoot across the dewy grass toward her own property, the morning sun painting her in gold. Jessica returned that evening just as the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of amber and red. This time she wore a simple dress and boots, her hair tied back with a piece of ribbon. Johnny had been watching for her from the window, Eli fussing in his arms, not screaming yet, but building toward it. When he saw her silhouette approaching across the field, he felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, yes, but something else too. Something that made him uncomfortable to name. She knocked softly, and he opened the door before the sound could fade. "He's starting up again," Johnny said, almost apologetically. Jessica held out her arms, and Johnny handed over his son. Within moments, she had Eli settled against her shoulder, that same gentle rocking motion, that same wordless humming. The baby's fussing stopped, just like that. Like she had some kind of magic in her hands that Johnny would never possess. Over the next week, a pattern formed. Jessica came every evening at dusk and stayed until Eli fell into deep sleep. Sometimes she came earlier, helping Johnny with the evening chores before taking the baby. She'd stir a pot on the stove while holding Eli, fold laundry one-handed, even help Johnny mend a section of fence while wearing the baby in a sling she'd brought from home. She moved through his space like water, filling the gaps he didn't know existed, never asking permission, never making him feel small for needing her. They talked during those long evenings quiet conversations in the lamplight while Eli dozed in Jessica's arms. She told him about her Samuel, how she'd carried him for 9 months, feeling him move and kick, only to deliver him in his silence. The midwife said sometimes babies just aren't meant for this world. Jessica said, her voice distant. But that doesn't make it hurt less. I had a nursery ready, a name picked out, a whole life planned. She looked down at Eli. I gave away all his things after Thomas died. Couldn't bear to look at them anymore. Johnny shared his own story, how Mary had been afraid from the moment she knew she was pregnant. She had dreams, he said, dark dreams about not surviving. I told her she was worrying over nothing, that women have babies every day. His voice cracked. She knew. Somehow she knew, and I didn't listen. Jessica reached across the space between them and touched his hand briefly. You couldn't have changed it, she said. Some things are written before we ever get a say. By the second week, Jessica was arriving in the afternoon. She'd bring food from her garden, cook meals that Johnny actually tasted, sweep the floors and open windows to let fresh air chase out the staleness of grief. The ranch hands noticed. Old Tommy, who'd worked for Johnny's father, tipped his hat to Jessica one evening and said, "Good to see this place breathing again, ma'am." Jessica just smiled and kept hanging laundry on the line. But the town noticed too. Johnny heard it first from the general store clerk, a comment dropped casual as poison. Heard the Bennett widows spending a lot of time at your place. The way he said it made Johnny's jaw tighten. She's helping with the baby, Johnny said flatly. The clerk smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm sure she is. When Johnny got home that day, he found Jessica in his kitchen, kneading bread dough with Eli sleeping in a basket at her feet. He almost told her about the clerk's insinuation, but the words stuck in his throat. What would he say? That people were talking? They always talked. That didn't make it her problem. Jessica felt the shift, though. The next time she went to town for flour, the women's conversation stopped when she entered. Mrs. Dean, the banker's wife, looked her up and down with cold eyes. Spending a lot of time at the place, I hear, she said loudly. People are starting to wonder about your intentions, Jessica. Jessica kept her voice level. I'm helping a neighbor in need. That's what we're supposed to do, isn't it? Mrs. Dean sniffed. There's helping, and then there's, well, his wife's barely cold in the ground, and you're playing house with her husband. The other women murmured agreement. Jessica bought her flour and left with her head high, but her hands shook as she loaded the supplies into her wagon. That night, she came to Johnny's ranch as usual, but something was different. She was quieter, more careful. She didn't hum as she rocked Eli. When Johnny asked if something was wrong, she just shook her head. People talk, she said simply. Let them, Johnny replied. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was. The night Jessica didn't come, Johnny knew something was wrong before the sun even set. He'd grown used to watching for her across the prairie, that familiar silhouette moving through the tall grass as evening fell. But tonight, the horizon stayed empty. Eli sensed it too. The baby grew fussier as darkness came, his whimpers building toward those soul-breaking screams Johnny had hoped never to hear again. Johnny tried everything Jessica had taught him. He rocked at the same rhythm, hummed the tune she always used, held Eli close with one hand on his back, just like she did. Nothing worked. The baby's cries grew louder, more desperate, and Johnny felt panic rising in his chest. By midnight, Eli was screaming just like those first terrible nights, and Johnny was pacing the floor with sweat running down his back despite the cool air. Please, he whispered to his son. Please, just tell me what you need. But even as he said it, Johnny knew the truth. Eli didn't need a technique. He needed Jessica. The baby had bonded to her, recognized her touch, her voice, her presence. And she was gone. The realization hit Johnny like a kick to the gut. What if she didn't come back? What if the town's gossip had driven her away? What if he'd become too dependent on her, let his son become too attached? And now they'd both pay the price. At dawn, with Eli finally exhausted into a fitful sleep, Johnny saddled his horse. He left the baby with old Tommy's wife, ignoring her knowing looks, and rode hard toward Jessica's property. The sun was just breaking over the hills when he reached her small ranch house. What he saw made his blood run cold. Her wagon stood in the yard, half loaded with crates and bundles. Furniture sat on the porch, ready to be hauled away. Through the open door, he could see bare walls where pictures had hung. Jessica emerged carrying a box and froze when she saw him. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the dusty yard. "You're leaving?" Johnny said. It wasn't a question. Jessica set down the box carefully. "Yes. When were you going to tell me?" His voice came out harder than he meant. "Tonight," she said quietly. "I was going to come by tonight to say goodbye." Johnny dismounted and walked closer, trying to keep his anger in check. It wasn't really anger, he realized. It was fear. Raw, terrifying fear. "Why?" he asked. Jessica looked away toward the horizon. "I got a job offer. In Denver. A respectable position as housekeeper for a merchant family. Good pay, room and board. I leave in 2 days." "That's not what I asked," Johnny said. "I asked why." Jessica's composure cracked. "You know why, Johnny? You hear what they're saying in town. About us. About me. I don't care what they say." "Well, I do." Her voice rose, sharp with pain. "I've been the subject of gossip before. After Thomas died, after Samuel, they whispered about how I must have done something wrong. Must have been cursed somehow. I won't go through that again." She wrapped her arms around herself. "And I won't drag you and Eli down with me." Johnny stepped closer. "Eli needs you. Eli needs a mother." Jessica shot back. "I'm not his mother, Johnny. I'm just a woman who shows up at night and leaves before dawn like something shameful." The words hung between them. "That's not what you are," Johnny said. "Then what am I?" Jessica's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What have I been doing all these weeks if not playing pretend? Living in someone else's house, mothering someone else's baby, pretending I have a family when I go home to an empty bed every night." The truth in her words cut deep. Johnny realized, with stunning clarity, how selfish he'd been. He'd let Jessica pour herself into his son, into his home, giving everything while he gave nothing back. He'd used her grief to fix his own, never thinking about the cost to her. "Jessica," he started, but she held up her hand. "Every night I hold Eli, I pretend he's mine," she said, her voice breaking. "I pretend I'm his mother, that this is my home, that this is my life. And then I walk back across that prairie and remember that my baby never took a breath, that my husband is dead, that I'm alone and always will be." Tears spilled down her cheeks now. "Holding Eli is the most beautiful torture I've ever known. It's healing me and destroying me at the same time. And I can't do it anymore, Johnny. I can't keep breaking my own heart every single night." Johnny felt something tear inside his chest. He'd been so focused on his own pain, his own needs, that he'd been blind to hers. "I'm sorry," he said. "God, Jessica, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "I know," she said softly. "That's what makes it worse. You've been nothing but kind. But kindness isn't enough. I need to leave before I forget that this isn't really my life." She turned back toward the house. "Find Eli a real mother, Johnny. Someone who can stay. Someone who won't have to sneak away like a thief every morning." "Jessica, wait," Johnny called, but she was already inside, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed across the empty prairie. Johnny rode back to his ranch in a daze, Jessica's words echoing in his head. When he collected Eli from Tommy's wife, she gave him a long look but said nothing. The baby fussed all day, crying for the woman who wouldn't be coming back. That night was hell. The next day was worse. By Sunday morning, Johnny was operating on pure instinct and something that felt like rage, not at Jessica, but at himself and the whole damn town that had driven her away. He dressed Eli in his best clothes, the little outfit Mary had sewn before she died. He put on his own church suit, the one he'd worn to the funeral. Then he saddled up and rode into town with his son in his arms. He hadn't been to Sunday service since Mary's burial. People stared as he walked through the church doors. The whispers started immediately, a rustling sound like dried leaves. Johnny ignored them and took a seat in the back pew, Eli quiet for once, those dark eyes taking in all the faces. The service started. Hymns were sung. The pastor began his sermon about loving thy neighbor. Johnny barely heard any of it. His mind was fixed on one thing, the injustice of what had happened. These people, these so-called Christians, had driven away the one person who'd actually lived those values. The one person who'd shown up when everyone else just offered empty prayers. After the sermon, before the final blessing, Mrs. Dean stood up. She had that look on her face, the one women got when they were about to dispense wisdom, whether you wanted it or not. "Brother," she called out sweetly, "it's so good to see you back in the Lord's house. We've all been so worried about you and that precious baby." Johnny said nothing, just watched her. "In fact," Mrs. Dean continued, "several of us ladies have been discussing your situation. A man alone with an infant, it's just not natural. We'd like to help you find a suitable wife. There's the school teacher, Miss Patterson, and the merchant's daughter just turned 20, very pretty and proper." The other women nodded eagerly, already planning his life like he was a child who couldn't dress himself. Someone else chimed in, "Yes, you need a good woman, a respectable woman." And then came the words that made Johnny's vision go red. "It's such a blessing that widow finally left you alone," another voice added. "The whole situation was just inappropriate. Her being at your place all hours, and poor Mary barely in the ground 3 months." Johnny stood up so abruptly that Eli startled in his arms. The church went silent. Every eye turned to him. The pastor looked surprised, but said nothing. Johnny walked slowly down the aisle until he stood at the front, facing the entire congregation. His heart was pounding, but his voice when he spoke was steady and cold as winter. "You want to talk about Jessica Bennett?" he said. "Let's talk about her." He looked around at all those pious faces. "My son screamed for 3 days straight. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought I was failing as a father. I prayed for help. And you know who God sent." He paused. "Not one of you. Not the ladies who are so concerned now. Not the pastor who talks about loving thy neighbor. Jessica Bennett showed up at my door at 3 in the morning, barefoot, and saved my son's life." The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Johnny's voice grew stronger. "For weeks, she came to my home every single night. She fed my baby, taught me how to be a father, brought food when I was too exhausted to cook, and never once asked for anything in return. And what did you people do? You whispered. You judged. You made her feel like trash for the sin of showing compassion." Mrs. Dean opened her mouth to speak, but Johnny cut her off. "She gave more in her kindness than any of you gave in your prayers. She showed up when I needed help, not when it was convenient or proper. And you call that inappropriate?" His voice cracked with emotion. "I call it the most Christian thing I've ever witnessed. More Christian than anything I've heard in this church." The pastor stood up. "Brother, perhaps we should discuss this in private." "No," Johnny said firmly. "I'm done with private. I'm done with being quiet while good people get torn apart by gossip." He looked at Mrs. Dean directly. "You want to know what's inappropriate? Driving away a grieving widow because you're more concerned with appearances than actual suffering. That's what's inappropriate." Eli began to fuss, sensing his father's agitation. Johnny bounced him gently, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer but no less intense. "Jessica Bennett lost her baby, lost her husband, lives alone on that failing ranch, and keeps going anyway. And when she heard my son crying across the prairie, she didn't think about what people would say. She just came, because that's who she is." He paused, and something shifted in his chest, a realization blooming like a flower he'd been too blind to see. "I stood here defending her honor," he said quietly, more to himself and the crowd. "But it's not just about honor, is it?" He looked up, and his eyes were bright. "I love her. God help me, I love Jessica Bennett." The church erupted in shocked whispers. Johnny barely heard them. The words had come out of his mouth before his brain had fully processed them. But now that they were spoken, he knew they were true. He loved Jessica, not just for what she'd done for Eli, but for who she was, for her quiet strength, her gentle hands, the way she hummed sad songs and made his broken house feel like a home. He loved her, and he'd been too caught up in his own grief and pride to see it. Mrs. Dean looked like she'd swallowed a wasp. "Brother, you're clearly overwrought. You don't know what you're saying." But Johnny did know. For the first time in months, maybe years, he knew exactly what he was saying. "I know what I'm saying, ma'am, and I know I've been a fool." He looked around at all of them. "You can judge me if you want. You can talk about me the same way you talked about her. But I'm done caring what this town thinks." The pastor cleared his throat. He was an old man, weathered and wise, and he looked at Johnny with something that might have been understanding. "Son," he said gently, "strong emotions can cloud judgment. You've been through a terrible loss. Perhaps you're confusing gratitude with something else." Johnny shook his head. "No, sir. I know the difference. I was grateful to the doctor who tried to save Mary. I was grateful to Tommy for helping with the ranch. That's not what this is." An unexpected voice spoke up from the middle pews. Old Tommy himself stood, hat in his weathered hands. "Begging your pardon, Pastor, but I've seen that boy nearly every day for months. I watched him dying inside after Miss Mary passed, and I watched him come back to life after Miss Jessica started coming around." He looked at Johnny with respect. "That ain't gratitude. That's something deeper." Another voice joined in, quieter. It was young Mrs. Anderson, who'd lost her own mother in childbirth. "Jessica helped me when my mama died. Sat with me for hours when I couldn't stop crying. Never told anyone, never asked for thanks. Just showed up." She looked at the other women defiantly. "If that's the kind of person you're running out of town, then maybe we should all look harder at ourselves." The tide was shifting slowly, like a heavy door being pushed open. But Mrs. Dean wasn't finished. "This is unseemly," she insisted. "His wife hasn't been gone half a year, and he's already declaring love for another woman. What kind of message does that send?" Johnny felt his temper flare again, but before he could speak, the pastor raised his hand. "Mary," he said, using Mrs. Dean's first name in a way that made her straighten. "Do you remember what Jesus said about the Good Samaritan?" Mrs. Dean blinked. "Of course, but I don't see what that has to do with anything." The pastor smiled sadly. "A man was beaten and left for dead. The priest passed by. The Levite passed by. But the Samaritan, the outsider, the one society looked down on, he stopped and helped. That's what Jessica Bennett did. She stopped when the rest of us passed by." He looked at Johnny. "Sometimes God sends us exactly what we need, even when it doesn't look like what we expected." Johnny felt his throat tighten with emotion. Eli had fallen asleep against his shoulder, one tiny fist curled in Johnny's shirt. The pastor continued, "Grief doesn't follow a schedule, Mary, and neither does healing. If this man has found love again after loss, who are we to say it's too soon? Who are we to measure another person's heart?" He turned to Johnny. "But son, have you told Jessica how you feel?" Johnny shook his head. "No, sir. I only just realized it myself. And now she's leaving, going to Denver in the morning." The pastor nodded slowly. "Then I suggest you have a conversation that's considerably overdue. This town and its opinions can wait. That woman cannot." He gestured toward the door. "Go. We'll finish this service without you." Johnny didn't need to be told twice. He hurried down the aisle, Eli still sleeping against him. As he passed, he caught a few supportive nods, a few cold stares, but mostly just stunned faces. He didn't care. He burst through the church doors into the bright Sunday morning and practically ran to his horse. The ride to Jessica's ranch felt like it took forever and no time at all. His mind raced with what he would say, how he would convince her to stay. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if he'd ruined everything by being blind for so long? What if she got on that wagon tomorrow and he never saw her again? When he reached her property, his heart sank. The wagon was fully loaded now, tied down and ready to go. Her horse was already hitched. She was leaving today, not tomorrow. He'd almost been too late. Johnny dismounted quickly and looked around. Jessica wasn't in sight. He called her name, Try not to wake Eli. No answer. Then he heard a sound from behind the house. The creek that ran through her property. He walked around the small ranch house and found her there, sitting on the bank with her feet in the water, staring at the current. She looked up when she heard him approach, and her expression went through shock, confusion, and finally resignation. "Johnny," she said softly, "what are you doing here?" He walked closer, adjusting Eli in his arms. "I came to tell you something. Something I should have said weeks ago." Jessica stood up, water dripping from her bare feet onto the grass. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." "I stood up in church today," Johnny said, the words tumbling out, "in front of the whole town, and I defended you." Jessica's eyes widened. "Johnny, you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did, because they were wrong about you, wrong about us, and I told them so." He took a breath. "But in the middle of defending you, I realized something. I wasn't just defending my baby's caretaker or my neighbor or my friend." Jessica wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture. "Johnny, stop." But he couldn't stop. "Not now. I was defending the woman I love." The words hung in the air between them. Jessica's face went pale. "No," she whispered. "You don't mean that. You're confused. You're grateful. You think you need me for Eli, but that's not love." Johnny stepped closer. "Don't tell me what I feel, Jessica. I know the difference. I loved Mary. That love was soft and easy and grew slowly over years. What I feel for you, it's different. It's fierce and it scares the hell out of me, but it's real." Jessica shook her head, tears starting to fall. "You need me because I can help with Eli. That's all. Once you find someone else who can do what I do, you'll forget all about me." "That's not true," Johnny said firmly. "Do you think I watch Eli when you're with him? I watch you, Jessica. The way you hum those sad songs. The way you touch your finger to his nose to make him smile. The way you move through my kitchen like you belong there, because you do belong there." His voice broke. "You belong with us. Not as a helper, not as a nurse, as family." Jessica turned away, her shoulders shaking. "I can't be Mary's replacement, Johnny. I won't be second choice, the convenient widow who showed up at the right time. I've been unwanted before. My first husband married me because his father made him, not because he loved me. I won't live like that again." Johnny's heart clenched at that revelation. He'd never known her marriage had been loveless. "You're not a replacement," he said, "and you're not second choice. You're the woman who knocked on my door in the darkness and brought the light back in. You're the woman who loves my son like he's your own. You're the woman I think about first thing in the morning and last thing at night." He paused. "You're the woman I want to build a future with, if you'll have me."